focused on investigating. Focused on investigating the relation between formal education rules and students' birth dates and performance. The idea is that everywhere around the world, formal education is organized in a way that tends to put together, at the moment of school entry, children who are quite a few months older or younger than each other. And for instance, if you think of a class built of children born in 2000, you're going to have children from January 2000, children from December 2000. They're quite a few months older and younger than each other, and researchers are interested in understanding how this might affect their performance. And yeah, this is a very empirical literature in the field of economics, and when you look at it as a whole, you can see that there's a big consensus here, in the sense that older school starters, they tend to perform better than their younger peers in the first years of the school cycle. This has been consistently documented by studies conducted with different methodologies, assessing data from all over the world. And yeah, this evidence was so robust, so large, that some people actually related to the uprising of the phenomena called redshirting, which actually stands for the choice by legal responsibles, let's say parents, tutors, teachers, the choice of intentionally delaying their children ingress in school on account of how they would actually perform better. And yeah, this literature actually developed in a way that it raised the question that I'm bringing here below. Should the early advantage persist and translate into better long-term educational and labor market outcomes for the same children? I'd say that there are two main conceptual frameworks here. One is aligned with the idea that it should. It's more aligned with Kuhn and Heckman's model of skill accumulation, the idea that older school starters, they should actually learn better than early ones due to being more mature, to being more ready for school. And throughout some key properties of their model, this gap should not only persist, but could even widen up throughout time. But this has been contested by some notorious work that has focused on decomposing this documented difference in performance between relative and absolute age effects, and in doing so, by emphasizing the role of absolute age effects as the major component causing this gap. And the thing with absolute age effects is that it's one thing to be a few months older than your colleague when you're both 6 and 7, and it's a completely different thing to be a few months older when you are 15, 17, 18. So despite these advances, I'd say that this field remains because the long-term literature on the school entry age, which is one focused on investigating long-lasting outcomes, it ended up assuming quite a mixed setup. So there's notorious work supporting both interpretations, and this is kind of where we are with our article. And yeah, we also point out to a factor here that we think that deserves attention, which is the educational and labor market trade-off that's explicit to this research agenda. Since entering school later also means having a somewhat delayed labor market entrance. If you think about a student who progressed regularly through school, if you enter 1 year later, you're going to leave 1 year later. And we understand that this might actually compromise these youngsters' human capital accumulation in terms of labor market experience. So this is the debate. Now talking about our article per se. We had the main goal here of providing some focused policy-related information on the matter of the school entry age in Brazil. We're doing so by investigating how a delayed school entrance influences some educational and labor market outcomes, such as year of schooling, college admission, and early labor market indicators. And we have the side goal with no big expectations, but to try and contribute to the maturing of the school entry age literature, doing so by making use of Brazilian longitudinal data, which is unusual, by tracking students not only across time, but across distinct data sets, and by utilizing RDD to provide evidence on the field of dispute here I've mentioned. So I'm gonna get to our data sources now. We rely on administrative data from Brazil. Most of our results are built with the use of the National Census school data from INEP. INEP is an institute that produces technical information on the field of education in Brazil. While it's a nationwide census, we actually use a subset here, which consists on data of students enrolled in each UF state capitals and also in the municipal network. Also from INEP, we utilize their service of access to proprietary data. This is what allowed the track of students through distinct databases, this being the higher education census, also from INEP, also nationwide, now with information on higher education level, and identifies Hive database, maintained by the former Labor Ministry, which got information on employment relations and employee characteristics from the formal labor market in Brazil. And we also utilize the National Household Sample Survey to build just a supporting result. We're not able to track students through this particular database as well. That's it for our data sources. Now still talking about a data setup, and when it comes to RDD, the idea here is to actually compare students in the limits of discontinuity generated by their date of birth and the cutoff date for school enrollment. So we understand that students born right before this cutoff date and whose compliers have enrolled in school in year T are good contrafactuals for the students born right after the cutoff date and who enrolled in year T+1. And in that sense, we can use RDD to measure treatment effects of having a delayed school entrance. This is why on the evidence I'm going to share with you guys, we're always talking of a cohort of students who enrolled in school in 2 subsequent years. And it's wise for me to stress that in educational terms, we are comparing the performance of students exposed to the same school time. So you're going to see a pretty particular time-wise metric here. We're actually measuring performance in terms of years after school entry. This educational terms. When it comes to labor market outcomes, however, we opted to compare them in the same moment in time to understand how the delayed school entrance would affect the labor market performance in an overall sense. And yeah, I'll bring some data setup limitation as well here. Our data school census panel microdata was only available from 2007 to 2017 at the time we run our analysis, and that's why we opted to work with 2 cohorts. So 2007, 2008 entrants and 2003, 2004 entrants. While the former is more precise, the latter allow longer run analysis. So it is on the second cohort, we could actually track them through a labor market and the higher education census databases. And both are built with similar strategies. We treasure them both, and I'm going to talk a bit about that now. A lot of the cohort building procedure, it revolved around the effort of finding each UF's cutoff date for school enrollment, and that wasn't as simple as it could have been because in Brazil's educational system, local governments, they have a relative autonomy regarding the implementation of educational policies. And that's why we opted to implement tests of structural breaks and discontinuity identification according Card et al. To find these cutoff dates. So, for example, for the 2007-2008 cohorts, 25 possible dates were tested as the limit date set for enrollment for each UF. And yeah, for each possible cutoff date, regressions to analyze how being born afterward this cutoff date would predict an enrollment in year T+1 here. So these simple linear probability models were run, and then the date optimum C here, which maximized the R2 of equation 1, was selected as cutoff for entrance into elementary school. And here I'm just going to share real quickly a visual identification of the relation of enrollments in relation to the cutoff date. So a big discontinuity here in January 2001 for the specific cohort in terms of São Paulo City. And yeah, after the search of UF's limit date set for enrollment, the data was pulled by card, normalized to do with the heterogeneity of cutoff dates. And the thing is that despite the lack of school census microdata before 2007, we could utilize a similar strategy for building the 2003-2004 cohort, since the discontinuity observed at the moment of school entry could also be observed, although attenuated in the following years of their school period. And yeah, you guys are probably wondering that this might lead to some problems. I'm going to talk about one of them, which is since we don't have precise information on students' first school enrollment, we are not able to actually generate local average treatment effects for this cohort. So the results I'll be presenting for the 2003-2004 entrants are intention to treatment results. And we understand, however, that they are comparable, and we can interpret Sharpe estimates as lower bounds of fuzzy estimates. So yeah, that's pretty much it for the process of finding each UF's cutoff date for school enrollment. After finding it and after normalizing for each UF, we selected the students who were born 100 days before and 100 days afterwards these cutoff dates. And that's how we came up with 2 data panels with quite a reasonable amount of information, as you can see. So our first cohort is able of investigating, as I mentioned, up to the 9th year after school entry. And in figure 4 here, we have the relation of years after school entry with the school grades for those that progress regularly to school. So 9th year after school entry would be the second last year of high school. And meanwhile, for the second cohort, 2003-2004 entrants, we were able of investigating up to the 13th year after school entry, which again, for those that progress regularly to school, would be a third year in a full-time labor market or higher education transition. And that's pretty much it for setting up our panels. Now I'm going to share with you guys our main results, starting with our school cycle results. And here we have the effects of age of school entry on complete years of education for the 3rd, 7th, and 9th year after school entry. We can see that these are pretty significant results, right? And that they are all positive in the sense that having a delayed school entrance actually means that these students, they are accumulating a higher amount of education in the same educational time exposure than early school starters. And here we have the series, the trend of these outcomes throughout time. So you can see that this effect, it actually rises up to the 6th year after school entry, then seems to stabilize a little bit. In here, I'm going to share a complementary result to this one. Students, older school starters, they accumulate more years of study in the same educational time because they fail less than early school starters, as you can see here. Although this outcome is more incisive in the first half of the period analyzed, it's still significant indeed in the second half as well. And so again, these are local average treatment effect, right? And here I just have summed it up. Suggests that older school starters are more efficient in progressing through grades. Now I'm going to share some results for the second cohort. So those are intention to treatment results. As I've mentioned before, they are able of looking a bit longer. And we find this very interesting, the results we have, because as you can see, in the 7 and 10 years after school entry are very significant results still and positive results. But then when we look at the 13 year after school entry, we see a null effect of age of school entry on complete years of education. So, and if we look at this series here, the trend of the outcome, we're going to see that for this particular cohort, the effect is actually decreasing throughout the whole period. And what this means is that at 12 already, but at 13 years after school entry, these students, they end up with the same educational level. In case you are wondering, why are we looking at these students' effect of age of school entry on complete years of education after the ideal time period of conclusion for them of the high school cycle? As I've mentioned before, I'll just go back really quickly here. For those that progress regularly, the 10 year after school entry should be the last year of high school. The thing is that if we look at the National School Census panel we have, we're going to realize that in all of these years, we still have a significant proportion of students enrolled in National School Census. So in a sense, it would be nice if we could even look a bit further. But yeah, anyway, that's a very important result for the sequence of our analysis. We are actually going to take the leverage here of the 13 years after school entry being a year where both groups have the same educational level to build our next hypothesis or next consideration interpretations. And here I'm sharing, therefore, a result concerning the duration of school life cycle for the same cohort. And yes, so again, this analysis was built 13 years after school entry, when both groups have the same educational level in terms of complete year of study. And we see a big discontinuity here in terms of duration of school life, which actually makes sense if we think that we saw that older school starters, they actually progress in a more efficient way through grades. And yeah, actually it's a difference of about 0.67 years less in school. That amounts to about 8 months less. So even both groups get the same number of years of schooling. Older school starters are spending 8 months less in school. And Yeah, also very interesting is if we take a look at age at school exit for these students, as I mentioned in the beginning, the trade-off we are dealing with in this analysis. Progressing through school faster, it's not enough to offset the 1 year wait these students have to endure before enrolling in school. So yeah, despite progressing through school faster, they are still leaving school at an older age than early school starters. And we take this as very important for the interpretation of our labor market and higher education transition results, which I'll share with you guys now. Starting with the labor market transition result, in table 5 here, we have the effects of age of school entry on the probability of employment in the formal labor market. And what this result shows us is that there is actually no effect of age of school entry on the probability of employment in formal labor market for all the period analyzed, for all along those years. We are going to take a bit of a leap here and assume that this lack of difference throughout those 4 years actually means that both groups have accumulated the same amount of experience in the formal labor market around this moment of school egress. And actually, this is very interesting once we look at the effects of age of school entry on formal labor market wages, because we see here in 2015 and a slightly significant, but more significant indeed, effect in 2016 and 2017, a negative effect of wage of school entry on formal labor market wages. So around the moment of school egress, older school starters, they are going to the formal labor market and they're earning less than early school starters. And yeah, let me just reinforce that we are actually tracking these students throughout this database as well. So same students we were analyzing in National School Census. And here just summing it up. And since, as we've just seen, that there's no difference in educational level for each group around the 12 and 13 years after school entry, which is precisely around the 2015, 2016, 2017 here, the years we're analyzing. Since there's no different educational level, and we just assessed that there's no formal labor market experience also difference between both groups, we understand that this evidence suggests that experience in the informal labor market should play a major role in the documented wage gap. And yeah, this is very interesting. This is actually in line with Seminario and its findings, emphasizes how informal labor contracts in Brazilian labor market are important as a means of career advancement, prevalent among the youngest components of the labor force. This kind of relation hasn't been explored in the literature. And yeah, however, this is just a hypothesis, right? I've mentioned in the beginning that we had a supporting analysis that was built with National Household Sample Survey, and that's it. And here I would like you to focus on the last 3 columns here that reveal how early school starters, they are more prevalent to be in a formal labor market employment position along those years. But this is a very problematic result because we're not able of investigating this difference in the discontinuity around the cutoff date for school enrollment due to lack of sample. So yeah, just a supporting result, still sharing with you guys though. And now we follow on to last but not least, our higher education transition result that actually reveals, and that's how we read it also, that there is no effect of age of school entry on the probability of higher education access for concerning both groups of students. And yeah, this is very interesting since it actually leads to the question, right? And already going into some concluding remarks. Given the evidence I've shared, were Brazilian older school starters actually able to learn better than their younger peers? Despite failing less, despite accumulating more years of studying the same educational time exposure, despite progressing through the school cycles in a faster pace, they are not more prone to entering college right after school completion, and neither they seem to be more productive than their peers from a labor market perspective, given their lower wages at the moment of school egress. So yeah, overall, our results, they reinforce the idea that there is an explicit trade-off here in educational and labor market prospects concerning starting school younger or older. I'm just going to read through these bullet points here as well. Again, to reinforce, late school entrants, they do fare better in educational outcomes throughout most of the period analyzed. Emphasis, however, in the early years of basic education, as well as the consensus around the debate on the literature. However, we are more in line with the idea and the conceptual framework that this early academic advantage seems to dissipate through time. It does not necessarily translate into better long-term educational or labor market indicators for the same group. And the thing is that despite progressing through school faster, these students, they wait a whole year before entering school. They leave formal education 0.3 years older than their counterparts. And given the similarities in education level between both groups, we understand that finish school at an older age is a probable reason for the lower formal wages around the moment of school completion. Well, it feels like I've been racing against myself, and that's my email. If you have any doubts, any idea you'd like to forward us, please do.
Thank you, Renato. Thank you very much. So we have a few minutes for questions. We have about 7 minutes for questions. Anybody has questions for Renato?
Renato, something that I might have missed there is what is the likelihood that you observe people in highs early in their careers?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
So what is the share of people you actually observe in highs early in their careers?
The share of people we're observing in highs in terms of the highs database and
proportion? In terms of the highs, yeah.
So we're actually following the same students I've mentioned. Let's see here. Sorry. So we're dealing with the second cohort, right? So data panel with in here you have 300,000 children born shortly before or after the cutoff date. These are the children we are following. Look, I won't be able to tell you what's the proportion of this in relation to highs. I know that highs is a pretty big database because it's not a sample survey database. It's actually an absolute relation database. So yeah, I'm not sure. I won't be able to answer that, but I can look into that. It's a pretty interesting question, but I'm just not able to actually give you a precise data, so I won't even try to guess.
Other questions for Renato? Renato, I do have a question for you.
No,
I guess it's 2 questions. So the first one is, how do your results compare to the literature? Are they consistent or not? Why? And the other question is, I think I didn't fully understand why the effect on years completed dissipates over time.
Yeah.
For the effect to dissipate, I guess what you need to have is that those that enter early, those that enter late begin to complete less over time. It has to balance out. The effect has to disappear somehow. Or maybe I'm not understanding it. So if you could explain it, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, so the first question about how our results compare to the literature. And yeah, were you also referring to in terms of robustness checks of our RDD estimates? Yes, or because, no, yeah. Yes, sorry. Because in terms of robustness checks, our results, they seem pretty robust. We have some validation tests I did not present here for the sake of time. But in terms of our RDD measures, they seem pretty straightforward. Our panel is also a pretty balanced panel. And yeah, that's what I would say in terms of methodology-wise. However, and comparing in terms of interpretation here, I'd say that, as I've mentioned, they are more in line, and I've put in here in the beginning of the presentation, the results are more in line with the idea that the effects, the long-lasting effects, they should dissipate with time. So there are quite a few work that also support this idea. So I think we're not alone in this line of interpretation. So the results, they are not isolated. But yeah, you've pointed out a pretty big, pretty important also question about why the effect dissipates, right? And when it comes to the second cohort of analysis. And we are actually not bringing here some evidence on school dropouts and school evasions, which is what you've mentioned. And we find those a little harder to interpret. But what we see is that throughout time, older school starters, they tend to drop out more of school. And so it would make sense in terms of what you're bringing, because the thing we are measuring this, and we are everyone that's in the panel for the whole years. And if someone drops out of school, the last year they attended, the last year of conclusion is the one that we are going to measure throughout the whole panel. So if older school starters are actually leaving and tending to evade more and drop out more, this makes sense what you're bringing, because yeah, it will actually even out and balance. So that's one way of looking at it, and it makes sense. But the other way, and that's I try to explain, but it's not it. I would need to have here the proportion of students. But the thing is that when we look at all those years, 11, 12, and 13 years after school entry, we still have a pretty significant proportion of students who are enrolled in school. So in Brazil, and let's see here, maybe this might help. So here we're looking at 13 years after school entry, right? And you see that the average duration for both groups is lower than 10 years. And we are talking of an ideal school cycle, ideal school period of 11 years. So even 13 years after school entry, when it comes to average duration at school, those children are not attending the duration required for completing high school. So this is kind of why we are giving them more time and trying to look at it on a bit further. So I would say that it kind of, and that's the way I look at it, I would say it also dissipates because, well, they tend to, the fact, that's what it seems, that's how can I put it? It seems like the edge in terms of educational performance for older school starters, it seems to dissipate throughout time because they're getting older in an absolute sense. Maybe their performance is being measured in a way that they are not actually, it's just in the sense that they could not actually learn better than early school starters. So as time goes, they tend to even out because in an absolute sense, it's one thing to be a few months older when you're 7, and it's another completely different thing to be a few months older when you're 16, 17, 18. So that's kind of how I would try to explain why the effect is dissipating. But of course, the evasion and dropout rates you have bring, they are also very important for the interpretation of results. And these are something we have and we are trying to work on, but we just couldn't actually put it together for this particular article. But yeah, I really thank you for your remarks, and I'm sorry if I ended up talking too long also, but feel free to reply, please, if you want to. Oh, I can't hear you.
Thank you very much, Renato. So that we can stay on time, let's move on to our second paper, but if anybody else has additional questions for Renato, please feel free to get in touch with him. Fernando, the floor is yours. Do you want a reminder, a 5-minute reminder, Fernando?
Sure, Maria Marta. Thank you very much. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Let me see. Okay, I hope everyone can see my slides. Hopefully that'll be all right. Okay, so today I will be presenting a paper entitled Greater Retention and Multidimensional Skill Formation in Young Children that is jointly authored with Miguel Zarzosa at Purdue University. So the motivation for our work follows from the idea that greater retention is a prevalent practice, and this is true across a variety of contexts. So for instance, in the US, we see that about 10% of 15th graders are retained at least once. This is true for 13% of children in the OECD, and these shares are even larger in Latin America, which is a pretty interesting area for future research, all in all. The way we're going to think about retention, and I think a way that retention can be perceived in general, is that this is a policy that can also be considered as a human capital investment decision. Why do we conceive of this policy in this dimension? The reason is in particular that this policy or this practice aims to bring students up to proficiency levels in a particular class or a particular skill dimension. With that in mind, a critical element of retention is that once students are retained, they're directly separated from their peers, which is a fact that could negatively affect their self-worth, right? Everyone in the school will know that these children are held back and they're no longer with the peers that they had been in class throughout their elementary school experience. On the other hand, if these children were struggling academically at their original grade level, we could otherwise think that retaining these kids could better help them understand class material. Therefore, these kids would develop confidence and they would be meeting children in the same developmental stage. So here we can think of these impacts of retention as going beyond the academic impacts of this practice, and there could be heterogeneity, or we could possibly think of retention both having a negative and or a positive effect on these children's socio-emotional development. So with this in mind, we posit that the literature has so far provided limited evidence regarding how retention affects children's non-cognitive skill development. So to this end, in this paper, we will present and estimate a dynamic model of skill formation in which our goal will be to recover the impacts of early grade retention, so retention that takes place for children early on in their schooling careers, and how this practice affects children's cognitive and non-cognitive skill development. So first, let me tell you a bit about our data. We will be using longitudinal data from the US from a cohort of kindergartners who are followed all the way up until the end of 5th grade. In our model, we'll be focusing on the survey rounds that are carried out between kindergarten and the end of 2nd grade. This is a very large data set that includes around 18,000 students that started out in the 2010-2011 academic year. With this in mind, I mentioned that we'll be focusing on early retention events. In particular, these are events that either take place in kindergarten or in 1st grade. So we're just going to model those two events as a joint decision. Are you retained in kindergarten or in 1st grade, or are you not retained, i.e. do you progress on time? And here we're just going to use a simple or a standard definition of retention, which is in the data, do we observe you enrolled in the same year that you had been enrolled in the previous year? If that is the case, we will consider you as having been retained. Okay, this data set, the ECLS K-2011, includes extensive information on family background characteristics, including students and parents' race, their gender, their age. We also know the household composition. We know the socioeconomic status of the family, the parents' education, and the household income as well. So there's a lot of evidence regarding background characteristics for the children and their families. Additionally, we'll have some information regarding parent socio-emotional status at a baseline, which follow from questions that parents respond to, which cover topics such as whether parents feel depressed, sad, lonely, or if they feel stressed, fearful, or anxious. So we'll have some information regarding parent socio-emotional characteristics. And what's going to be a critical element within our analysis is the role of parental investments. So within this framework, we're additionally going to consider how much parents invest in their children and how the investment is linked to the prevalence of retention and the skill formation process as well. So here we're going to be relying on information that is given by the number of books that the parents have for the children, the types of activities, and the number of activities that they do with their kids, which cover a variety of topics within this. And then, as I mentioned, our goal is to try to understand the development of cognitive and non-cognitive skill. So to this end, we're going to rely on information included in the ECLS, which are tests that children take every year in math, reading, and science. These are graded through IRT grading. And then we're additionally going to rely on information on children's socio-emotional skills that is directly reported by the teachers of these children. So those are going to be the measures that we're going to use on socio-emotional skills, and these cover a variety of measures, such as whether children can overcome obstacles in class, whether children persist through difficulties, and there's a lot more questions included in the analysis regarding those topics that once again are asked of teachers. So let me tell you a bit about our summary statistics. We're going to split the sample by children who are retained and non-retained. So now I'm going to show you this first column provides summary stats for a full sample. The second one is for non-retained children, and the third one is for retained children. And what we see in this first panel right here is that, for instance, boys are more likely to have repeated a grade early in their career, as are younger children. And this is also true for children coming from lower SES households, where they're measured by their parental education, the prevalence or the likelihood that both parents live in the household, or the household income. And then importantly, as you will see very clearly here, hopefully, is that there's very strong sorting regarding children's cognitive skills in terms of the likelihood that they're retained. So here we see that the children who repeat a grade at baseline had much lower math, science, and reading test scores, but we also see fairly strong evidence of children being retained depending on their socio-emotional development. So children who at baseline had much lower teacher-reported non-cognitive skills were much more likely to have been retained early in their schooling. So these are just summary stats. Another way that we can try to assess the extent to which retention is related to children's skills is through graphical evidence, looking at the distributions of skills. So here in the left panel, we're looking at how children's skills relate to the likelihood of formation. So first we can focus on the dashed line. This grayish dashed line denotes the skills for children who repeat a grade at baseline, whereas the dashed gray or black line denotes the baseline skills for children who do not repeat a grade. This is a cognitive dimension right here in this left panel. So we see a fairly large difference in the distribution of skills between retained and non-retained children at baseline. And what we see at end line is that these differences here in the solid lines, these differences still remain. So we still see a very large gap in the cognitive skills of retained and non-retained children. One more thing, in case it wasn't clear, is that whether kids repeat a grade or not, they're still taking the same exam. So here the scores are directly comparable. You shouldn't worry that kids who repeated a grade are taking an easier exam. And in fact, in the cognitive dimension, maybe the two distributions seem to be widening a bit. So possibly from this graph, we see that retention might have a negative impact on cognitive development. When we instead look at non-cognitive development, once again looking at the dashed lines, which relate differences at baseline between retained and non-retained children, we still see fairly large differences. Retained kids had much lower non-cognitive skills at baseline, but then when we look at end line, which are given, the distributions are given here by the solid lines, we see that the difference in the distribution seems to have narrowed a bit. Right? So this is very suggestive evidence just coming from the reduced form analysis, but here we see that it is possible that retention could have heterogeneous impacts depending on whether we consider cognitive versus non-cognitive skills. And one additional thing I want to remark is that the bulk of the literature so far has focused on examining the impacts of retention on cognitive skills, and there's been very limited focus on the non-cognitive dimension. So with those motivating facts in mind, we can move on, or I'll move on to telling you a bit about our model. So within this, we'll be introducing this dynamic model of skill formation, which will account for endogenous grade retention and will allow us to assess the heterogeneous impacts of retention across children's cognitive and non-cognitive skills, as well as heterogeneity in the impacts of retention depending on children's skills at baseline. So the model is going to include 5 main ingredients. The first one is we will distinguish between observed measures from latent abilities, here with the idea that every observed test score or non-cognitive skill will be capturing the underlying constructs of cognitive and non-cognitive ability with error. Additionally, this model will allow us to incorporate the importance of self and the cross-productivity of skills. We will additionally incorporate the importance of parent socio-emotional skills and their investments that they make in their children, and allow for both of these components to affect children's skill development. We will also allow, as I mentioned before, for heterogeneity in the impacts of retention based on children's baseline skills. And lastly, we will estimate retention-specific production functions. And that will also vary depending on whether we're looking at cognitive and non-cognitive skills. One additional feature of our model, which I won't have that much time to get into, is we can additionally assess how changes to retention policies in the US can affect the skill development process. So just to give you a little bit of the notation that I'll be using for the next few minutes, here these theta S's are going to capture children's cognitive and non-cognitive skills at time tau, which can be baseline, which is T, or end line at T+1. Here theta P is going to capture parents' socio-emotional skills. The I's are going to capture parents' investment in their children's. And an essential element here is that Ri is going to be a binary variable, which will equal 1 if children repeat a grade and 0 if they don't. So now I'm going to give you a graphical overview of our model, which took me a bit longer than I wish it had to put together. So this might be worth showing right here. So within this framework, we can start with a setup at baseline. So in the baseline time period, that is when children enter kindergarten for the first time, that's the first time you observe them in the data, we're going to consider parents and their children. For parents, we're going to have a set of observed characteristics and their latent socio-emotional skills. For children at baseline, we're also going to have their observed characteristics as well as their cognitive and non-cognitive skills. Moreover, within this framework, we're going to allow for parental investments to be a function of both the parent's characteristics and the children's skills at baseline. The idea here is that we want to incorporate the fact that parents may engage in compensating or reinforcing investments based on their children's skills. We're additionally going to model retention as being a function of both the children's characteristics at baseline, capturing here that lower skilled children might be more likely to repeat a grade, the parent's socio-emotional skills at baseline, a set of observable characteristics, and importantly, we're going to have school level retention policies. So the ECLS nicely includes extensive information regarding whether schools tend to have policies that make it more likely that the kids will repeat a grade or not. So once we've accounted for the importance of retention, we've modeled parental investments, we're going to allow for all of these components to enter the production of function of skills at endline. So here we see that skills are at endline will be given by this function, which will be retention specific. And this will further incorporate heterogeneity depending on children's baseline skills, their parents' socio-emotional skills, and the investments that parents have made in their children. So now getting into the actual model, we're going to model the skill formation process or skill development as being defined by CES production functions that are once again retention specific. So here we're going to have a production function for children who progress on time, that is children who are not retained, and one for children who repeat a grade. These production functions are going to have 4 inputs, and these inputs will be the children's cognitive skills at baseline, the non-cognitive skills at baseline, the parents' socio-emotional skills, and the parents' investments in their children. And once again, these production functions will also be specific or dependent on the skill dimension that we consider at endline, right? So we're going to have a production function for cognitive skills and a production function for non-cognitive skills. Additionally, we're going to model the retention process as in a fairly standard Roy model framework in which retention will depend on background characteristics of the children and of the parents socio-emotional skills, the children's cognitive and non-cognitive skills, as well as school level characteristics within this framework. An important advantage of the CES is we will be able to estimate the elasticity of substitution between inputs, and unlike a Cobb-Douglas production function, we will not be imposing the assumption that this theta S will be equal to 1. And here the CES also allows us to capture static and dynamic complementarities. Within this framework, this is something that I mentioned in the graphical slide, we're going to allow for parental investments to depend on background characteristics, the parents' socio-emotional skills, and the children's cognitive and non-cognitive skill. An important component here is that we will want for these beta C's and beta NC's to tell us whether parents are engaging in reinforcing investments, which would be the case if parents who had children with higher skills invested more in them, or in compensating investments, which would be true if parents invested more in their children if they had lower skills. The second important element of this framework is we're going to additionally allow for parental income to affect the investments that parents make in their kids. And as a standard in these models with Cunha Heckman or Francesca Lucignelli and Matt Wiswell's work, household income will act as an instrument for parental investments because household income does not directly enter into the production function. So this is a strong assumption that is fairly standard in these models of skill formation. So I mentioned that an essential element of our framework is to distinguish between observed cognitive and non-cognitive skill measures from their latent constructs. So to do so, we will once again follow the standard literature on latent factor models by allowing these test scores to be proxies of latent skills and observables through a linear, we're going to consider that these will be given by a linear model. So specifically, for each observed measure that we have access to in the ECLS data that corresponds to a skill dimension S that is either cognitive or non-cognitive in each of the time periods at baseline or at endline, we're going to assume a dedicated measurement system. So here we're going to have measures that are either cognitive or non-cognitive, and these will be a function, once again, of household and children background characteristics, the skill dimension that we want to recover, and an error term that will be independent of both the theta and of the X within the setting. We're additionally going to allow for the observed measures of parent socio-emotional skills to also be a noisy function of an underlying variable capturing parent socio-emotional skills. So we're going to similarly set up this linear measurement system in which observed parents socio-emotional skills are a function of parents' latent socio-emotional skills. And we're going to allow for the same, or we're going to incorporate the same measurement system for parents' investments in their kids. So as I mentioned before, in the data, we have access to a number of measures regarding parents' investments in their children. And here we're going to consider that those measures might be noisy proxies of an underlying construct of parental investments in their children. So here we're going to try to incorporate the fact that observed measures may measure these underlying constructs with significant noise. And the identification strategy is fairly straightforward. We're going to be relying on the covariances and the variances across observed measures to recover the relevant parameters of this measurement system. So our estimation strategy will follow a two-step procedure. In this first step, we will be estimating the measurement systems at both baseline and at endline, as well as for parents' socio-emotional skills and their investments to identify the distributions of theta. Once we've secured the distributions of theta, and this is something I should have mentioned, we assume that all the error terms are normally distributed, which means that despite the factors being non-identified non-parametrically, this really nice paper by Joachim Fragerberg in the Restart 2018 provides the proofs regarding non-parametric identification, but as a standard in this literature, we can make the assumption of a normally distributed error terms, which will allow us to estimate this first stage for the measurement system using a maximum likelihood estimator. And once we've secured the distributions of the underlying factors, we will then estimate this Roy-like model of potential outcomes, allowing for the retention status specific CDS skill production functions. So in the second stage, we're going to model the retention process, and we're additionally going to estimate the retention specific CDS production functions that I introduced earlier. Okay, so that's our estimation strategy. So we will now move on to looking at results. The first thing that I'm showing you evidence from is what are the determinants of parents' investments in their kids. So here we, for instance, see that parents who have higher income at baseline tend to have larger investments in their children. We additionally see that more educated households with more educated parents additionally exhibit more investments in their kids. And when the parent who's reporting the responses is male, the investments tend to be lower. Important to our framework, there's two things I want to highlight. The first one is that parents who have higher socio-emotional skills at baseline tend to invest more in their children. And we additionally see strong evidence of parental reinforcing investments in their kids. So this indicates that a child with a 1 higher standard deviation in cognitive skills at baseline tends to receive additional investments in the range of 0.12 standard deviations. And we also see that parents also engage in reinforcing investments in terms of their children's non-cognitive skills at baseline. So this is something that's been found in the literature before, but this is going to matter for how we think about the impacts of initial skills on endline skills being mediated through the effects of retention. The second thing that I want to show you is how children's baseline skills relates to the likelihood of repeating a grade. So here I'm presenting evidence regarding the joint deciles of the cognitive and non-cognitive skill distribution at baseline. For instance, we see here that children who are in the top joint decile of the distribution, only about 1 or 2% of them are repeat a grade either in kindergarten or in first grade. Once we move up the distribution of cognitive skills all the way up to here, we see that children who have very low cognitive skills are much more likely to have repeated a grade with a likelihood of repetition exceeding about 10%. But we also see that non-cognitive skills play an important role, right? Because if here we look at a child in the bottom decile of the cognitive distribution and the top decile of the non-cognitive distribution, the likelihood of retention is 12%. Whereas if that child is in the bottom joint decile of both skills, here the likelihood of retention would increase to 17%. So it's not just solely a function of cognitive skills, but also a function of non-cognitive skills. Now we will move on to present evidence regarding the estimated average treatment effect of retention on children's cognitive and non-cognitive skills at endline heterogeneously depending on their baseline skill levels. So first, Maria Marta, how much time do I have left? 5 minutes. Okay. So given that, before I do that, actually, I'll quickly note the estimated parameters from the CES production function. So within this, we see so here are the estimated parameters of children's, of the skill development process for non-cognitive skills for children. The first column shows the parameters for non-retained kids. The second column shows the parameters for retained kids. Here we first see very strong evidence of self-productivity. So children who have high non-cognitive skills at baseline have higher non-cognitive skills at endline. And we still see evidence of cross-productivity. So children with higher cognitive skills at baseline have higher non-cognitive skills at endline. Something important to note is that while we don't reject that the production function for non-retained kids exhibits a Cobb-Douglas production function as the elasticity of substitution equals 1, we strongly reject the case that we have a Cobb-Douglas for retained children. We additionally see very limited importance of parent socio-emotional skills on the non-cognitive skill development of children, as the estimated gammas are below 0.04 in both of these cases. For cognitive skills, we similarly see strong evidence of self-productivity and some evidence of cross-productivity. Okay, so, oh, and one last thing I wanted to remark is that parental investment, so children's baseline skills are also affecting the end-line skills through parental investments, and since parents engage in reinforcing investments in their kids. So now moving on to the estimated impacts of retention on children's skill development, we first see that retention has very heterogeneous impacts on children's cognitive skills, depending on the baseline skills that children have. So for instance, here the outcome variable of interest is children's skills at end line, and we see that retention has very negative impacts on cognitive skill development at end line for children who are at the bottom decile of the skill distribution to begin with. So these are the kids who are most likely to have been retained, and these children, their cognitive skills at end line drop by about 0.4 standard deviations. On the other hand, we see strong positive impacts for the very small share of high-skilled children who repeat a grade, and these effects are in the range of 0.3 standard deviations. So there's a variety of reasons by which these results might emerge. This has been highlighted in the literature before. One reason is that these children might be best positioned to take advantage of learning the material again, or secondly, that retention may lead these high-skilled children's parents to invest more in their kids. Once we look at non-cognitive skills, we see a very different story. So what we find here instead, here we're once again looking at the bottom decile of the skill distribution, is that retention has negligible effects on children non-cognitive skill development if they're above the joint median of the skill distribution. But for low non-cognitive skilled students who have higher cognitive skills, so these are children who have very low confidence to begin with, repeating a grade leads them to have much higher confidence. So one possibility that leads to this result is that retention may lead these children to better understand class material, and thus these children may be gaining confidence in their ability and thus boost their non-cognitive skills at end line. So this is where we see the bulk of the effect. Children who had very low self-confidence or low non-cognitive skills at baseline tend to have more positive impacts on their non-cognitive skills at end line. So the last thing I'll do in the maybe 1 or 2 minutes that I have left, hopefully, is that we will give you very brief evidence regarding a policy relevant parameter regarding the impacts of retention. So the essential element behind this exercise is the fact that holding children back or retaining them entails very significant cost to the schooling system. So one basic approximation to this is that children who repeat a grade typically tend to have to take an additional year of school. I mean, there might be some heterogeneity, but there's no clarity there. So if these children are held back for a grade, the school system has to pay for an additional $11,000, which is how much an additional year costs. So the alternative policy we will consider is what if instead of holding children back, governments or school systems eliminated retention and instead gave parents $11,000 to directly invest in their children. So here we're going to take advantage of our estimated model. And since we incorporate the importance of income through parents' investments, we can shut down the possibility of retention and instead compensate parents to make investments in their kids. So in the next slide, I will show you evidence regarding how compensating parents or paying parents basically to invest in their children instead of holding these children back would affect the skill formation process. And what we're going to see here is that once we implement this policy, the first panel shows evidence of non-cognitive skills, the second on cognitive skills. Compensating parents in terms of their income and eliminating retention would lead to pretty negligible impacts on children's non-cognitive skill development, with only positive impacts for very high-skilled children at baseline. On the cognitive dimension, we would see that eliminating retention and compensating parents to invest in their children would lead to very large positive effects on children's cognitive skill development. So here we see that if the focus of these policies or the focus of retention is to improve outcomes for low-skilled children at baseline, then possibly compensating parents in terms of their income and eliminating retention could lead to substantial gains in terms of cognitive skill development. So with that in mind, I think I might be out of time, so I can wrap up the presentation for now and leave it there in the conclusion slide. And thank you so much for your time and for being here.
Excellent, Fernando. Thank you. Thank you very much. Questions for Fernando?
I have one, actually. So I was thinking about your specific measures for non-cognitive skills here, and if there's any possible concern about endogeneity. I'm thinking that maybe the kids that were retained are going to have like this big impact on the perception of teachers because they are those evaluating the kids in this dimension. And if this is the case, like what's your insight on this? And if you think it's concerning, do you think there's a way to control for something in the measurement system so that this concern can be ameliorated? And thanks for your presentation.
So,
oh, sorry, Maria Marta, go ahead.
Perhaps to be more efficient, why don't we pull the questions? Are there other questions for Fernando?
Hi, Fernando. I also have a question. So, do you look at differential effects at different stages of these grades? So the effect of retaining a student in their first year might be different of retaining students in their fifth year, for example. And also if you do something about the effect on those students' peers. So it could be also that having a grade retained student in your classroom has an impact on the peer, and how would that what role would that have in your analysis? Thank you.
Well, other questions? Fernando, go ahead. Because
Okay,
you have
thank you.
3 minutes to answer.
Okay, I'll try to be
Four
very
questions.
quick. So these are good and difficult questions. So Maka, regarding peer effects, we don't directly consider that, though I think that is a very interesting channel that could arise. As you can imagine, incorporating peers within these skill formation models is quite difficult. Estimating this without peers is already difficult enough. Regarding your first question, that is something that we considered, allowing for differential impacts depending on the stage at which children are retained. The one issue in the US is that only a small share of kids repeat each grade. So about 3% of our sample repeats kindergarten, 3% repeats first grade. And when you want to estimate these structural models in which you have to recover a lot of parameters, the sample sizes get very small, which led us to have to pool the data. Though in other contexts, such as Chile, and I looked at the data there, the prevalence of retention is much higher. So this like heterogeneity across grades and the timing could be much of interest. We didn't want to ask too much of the model by just separating out each of the grades. So though that is something that we might have to do if referees ask for that. Hopefully that's enough of a short answer that I'm still in time. Alejandra, regarding your question, I think that that's a great question and important concern within our framing. So two things I want to say here is that first off, it is true that teachers could know about the kids having been retained, and if they had direct knowledge of that, just using the teacher's measures might not allow us to solve for that. Another concern here might be that these children they're older than the other kids who are not retained, right? So that teachers could infer that the kids are retained for that. Something that we do is we directly control for the peers' ages. So there will be some grades in which the retained kid is much older than their peers, and other grades because this data set varies across schools. So there's some heterogeneity in the peers composition on their age based on the retained kid. So that's something that we do just to assess whether there might be some heterogeneity there. The second thing that we're trying to incorporate, though this is a bit tricky, is we also have access to measures on parent-reported non-cognitive skills of the kid. So the parents in the data answer questions regarding whether they perceive their kids to be perseverant, to have grit, so on and so forth. So that's something that we considered. Fortunately, it's a little bit tricky because first you could also think of parents being biased and differentially biased regarding the likelihood of retention. And the second thing is that the correlation between parent-reported and teacher-reported non-cognitive skills isn't as high as we would like it to be to incorporate it within the model. So this is something that we're still working through, but that is a super important consideration. So I thank you very much for your question. Maria Marta, hopefully I got there on time, and maybe I'll stop sharing my slides now and we can move on to your presentation. Thank you, and thank you all for your questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So let me share my screen here. You were very efficient, Fernando. You finished with 10 minutes, just 10 seconds to spare. Okay, perfect. So let me share my screen here.
Maria Marta, I can keep track of the time if you want me to.
Give me a 5-minute warning, please.
I would be happy.
Thank you. Let me move this over here. Okay, great. And Fernando, can you guys see my slides?
All good.
Can you see them?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Okay, well, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure for attending this session. And it's a pleasure to be here presenting what makes a program good, evidence from short cycle higher education programs in Latin America and the Caribbean. And this is joint work with my World Bank colleagues, Lelis Dinarte and Marina Bassi, and with Sergio Ursua from the University of Maryland. Okay, so let me start by explaining what short cycle higher education programs are. These programs are defined by UNESCO as being 2 or 3 years long. They are more practical than bachelor's programs, oriented towards the labor market, and they could give a pathway towards a bachelor's program. In the United States, these are the programs that lead to an associate's degree and that are typically taught at a community college. And in the in Latin America, they go by multiple names depending on the countries. They are called programas técnicos tecnológicos, carreras cortas, carreras terciarias, cursos tecnólogo in Brazil. And these programs could be a great promise for Latin America and the Caribbean because they form skilled human capital faster than a bachelor's program. And they do that in traditional fields, the fields where these programs actually started, like advertising, nursing in some countries, but also in more innovative fields like app design, digital animation, cybersecurity, big data, nanotechnology. And these programs are attractive to many students, people who don't have interest in a bachelor's program or time, resources, academic readiness, but also people who might be seeking new skills even after obtaining a bachelor's degree. They're also attractive to employers. So according to World Bank surveys, 1/3 of employers in the region struggle to find qualified labor. This is the highest fraction in the world, which of course this tells us about a disconnect between that which is produced by the higher education system and that which is demanded by the firms. And so these programs could really play a key role in upskilling and reskilling the population, especially in this post-COVID world. Now, in order to fulfill that promise, the programs have to be good. And so however, what we know is that there is tremendous variation in the academic and labor market outcomes of these programs. So we're actually going to exploit that variation to answer the question of what makes a program good. And by good, we mean programs that provide good academic and/or labor market outcomes, controlling for student, program, and higher education institution characteristics. So our notion of good is very close to the notion of value added, and a good program for us is a high value added program. And in particular, what we want to do is we want to identify the quality determinants. In other words, the practices of the programs. What is it that programs do? For example, do they connect with the private sector? Their inputs, what kind of teachers do they hire? And their characteristics, are they accredited or not? Do they have a special accreditation or not? The ones that are in fact connected with the value added of the programs. And so we use the term quality determinant to refer generally to these practices, inputs, and characteristics. But although quality determinant might have a causal connotation, we are not implying causality whatsoever during this analysis. Now, answering this question of what makes a program good is usually limited by lack of data. Very often, we don't even know the outcomes of these programs. But more often than not, the real limitation has to do with not knowing anything about the quality determinants. We really don't know what the practices of the programs are. We don't know it for Latin America. We don't know it for the United States. And in fact, we don't know it for the world in general. And because we don't know that, the quality of these programs remains a black box. We know that it varies across programs. We just don't know why. So what we do in this paper is fundamentally, we try to overcome this data limitation. On the quality determinants front, we designed and implemented the World Bank Short Cycle Program Survey to learn about the determinants. And on the outcomes front, on the one hand, this survey does tell us what the aggregate outcomes are. The directors of the survey report something about quality determinants, but they also report the aggregate outcomes of the programs. But in addition, we go to student level data from the programs using administrative sources in Brazil and Ecuador. And to our knowledge, this is the first paper to gather this type of data. And it's actually unique in the world in that sense, to measure associations between a very large set of determinants and outcomes, and to do it for multiple countries. So let me tell you something about our survey. This survey was administered to short cycle program directors from Brazil, the states of Sao Paulo and Ceará, Colombia, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, and Peru. And in Peru, we focused on licensed programs, which are 16% of all the programs. And altogether, these countries account for slightly over a half of the total short cycle program enrollment in the region. The survey took place between September 2019 and October 2020. About half of the of the surveys were filled out during the pandemic, and they were done either over the phone or online. The instrument had about 65 questions that were mostly the same across countries. Now, the countries really encompass a pretty wide institutional variation. So here we are looking for the various countries, a number of institutional aspects. For example, as a share of all higher education enrollment, short cycle programs are very large in Colombia, not so much in Dominican Republic. By the way, the average for LAC is very close to Brazil, so it's about 10%. So short cycle programs are taught, depending on the country, in universities, in non-universities, or perhaps in both types of institutions. And so in Peru, for example, they're all taught outside universities, but in Brazil, they're mostly taught at universities. The share of students enrolled in private institutions is very high in Peru and in Brazil, not so high in the other countries. And for-profit institutions are allowed in Brazil and in Peru, but not in the other countries. Let me tell you something about the sampling framework of the survey. So for every country here, we first start by looking at the universe size. In other words, the number or the set of all short cycle programs, and which is very large in Brazil and in Colombia, not so large in the other countries. And so in the other countries, because there are not that many programs, we actually surveyed the universe. Whereas in Brazil and Colombia, because of this very large number of programs, we designed stratified samples. Now, when we went to the field to conduct the interviews or the surveys, we learned that many of the programs in our sample had actually closed. Now, this is the number of effective surveys, and this is the response rate adjusted to take into account the programs that had closed. The remarkable thing is that even having conducted half of the surveys during the pandemic, in fact, we got a 70% response rate. So we gathered a very rich set of information in this survey on the student body. So the idea is, once again, we went to the program directors and we asked them a whole set of questions. And on the student body, they told us about the demographics of the student body, their academic deficiencies at entry on the program, how long the program is, how large, how many cities offer it for the institution, about the institution, whether it's public or private, is it a university or not, is it for profit or not, how old it is, how large. And in terms of student outcomes, the directors told us about academic outcomes, in particular, the graduation rate and the time to degree, and labor market outcomes, formal employment and salaries. And we gathered a lot of information on quality determinants, and we group these determinants into 6 categories. The first one is infrastructure. So tell us about your equipment. How often do you maintain it? Do you do online teaching? In terms of curriculum and training, what competencies do you teach? Do you have a fixed or a flexible curriculum? What are your graduation requirements? Do you have mandatory internships? Do you do academic remediation? In terms of cost, how much do you charge in tuition? Are there funding options for the students? Does the institution receive funding? In terms of link with the productive sector, do you have board members coming from firms? How do you engage with the firms? Do you support your students in their job search? With regards to the faculty, what are their demographics? How do you hire and train your faculty? How do you evaluate them? And then other practices. For example, how do you choose admission, or how do you determine admission? What is your board composition? Do you use data to make decisions? Now, as all surveys, our survey faces a couple of big potential issues. The first one is self-selection into responding. It might be that the surveys that are responding, that the institutions that are responding are the largest ones or the best ones. And so to address this thing, we conducted some statistical tests that gave us the confidence that the respondents are in fact representative of the universe by country. And in the few cases in which they are slightly different, we recalibrated the sampling weights to adjust for the differences. The other big concern is self-reporting. We are here asking the program directors, how much do your graduates make? So they have every incentive, we might think, to misrepresent the information. And so to deal with this problem, we wrote the respondents a letter assuring them that this data collection was entirely confidential, anonymous, and that the results would only be reported in an aggregate fashion. The respondents also knew that the survey was conducted by the World Bank. It was not conducted by the governments. The governments did not know anything about the individual responses. But more importantly, we validated the outcomes reported by the program directors using country-specific administrative data and household surveys. So for example, we looked at the average salary reported by program directors in Colombia. We went to household surveys in Colombia and to country administrative data for Colombia, and we validated these averages. And in fact, the validation worked incredibly well. So let me tell you something about the outcomes, beginning with the dropout rate. Again, outcomes reported by program directors, but that passed the validation test that we set up. So we see that the average dropout rate, and this is the percent of students who dropped out from their last year of studies, the ones that should have graduated last year, varies across countries. It also varies within countries. Extra time to graduate, how much longer do students take on average to graduate as a percent of the mandatory or the statutory duration of the program. And once again, it varies across countries and within countries. Formal employment. And what I mean throughout for formal employment is the following question. We asked the program directors, do all or almost all of your graduates find employment in the formal sector? So that's our notion of formal employment. And so as we can see, formal employment is high in Brazil and lowest in Peru and Ecuador. And now I'm going to show you average annual wages for graduates by country, once again, reported by program directors. And I'm going to measure it in two ways. One is in dollars, adjusted by purchasing parity, power parity, and the other one is as a multiple of the minimum wage. Once again, variation across countries and definitely within countries. Okay, now, we asked many questions about quality determinants grouped into 6 categories. I want to show you a few stats corresponding to quality determinants from links with industry, because these are the ones where these programs are really special and where they differ in a very strong way from bachelor's programs. And so I'm going to show you the percent of surveyed programs that report each of the practices listed below, some of which have to do with industry engagement and others having to do with job search assistance. So most of the programs have some kind of agreements with industry to so that their students can have internships. They assign somebody for industry relations. They ask the local firms what it is that they need. They ask the local firms whether they're happy with the graduates they are producing. They have agreements with the firms so that the firms can train their faculty. Also, most of these programs support their students in various ways. For example, they provide them with job market information, they train them for job interviews, they coordinate at times the job interviews, and many of them run an employment center. Okay, let's go back to our question. Our question is, what makes a program good? And so in order to answer this question, we do 2 separate estimations. Let's go to the first one. The first one uses only data from the survey. And so it looks at the aggregate outcomes, the average outcomes per program as reported by the program directors. And so the goal here is to take those program level outcomes and regress them on the quality determinants. What is there are 2 issues. The first one is that there are a lot of possible determinants. So how are we going to choose among determinants to run these regressions? And in some cases, we run into an issue of small sample sizes, especially when we want to do analysis by country or by type of institution or by field of study. And so to address these problems, we use Lasso. And Lasso, for us, selects the parsimonious set of determinants that provides the best fit. And so in particular, what we do is we follow a 2-stage procedure. In the first stage, we implement Lasso to select the determinants. And so this is an outcome, say dropout rate. And so this is the outcome for program J in country C and field F. And so what Lasso does is it runs a whole bunch of regressions that are going to give us the best set of determinants in terms of explanatory power. All of those regressions include a set of determinants, which Lasso varies throughout the algorithm. And remember, there are 6 categories, controls by student, program, and institution characteristics. LASSO doesn't select anything here. These characteristics are always fixed. Those regressors are always there. We also always have some survey noise variables. For example, how many times did you have to call this program until they answer? And we always have country fixed effects and field fixed effects. Then LASSO will give us the most explanatory set of quality determinants. And then what we do is we regress the outcome on that best set of determinants. So what we do is we regress the outcome on the best set of determinants, once again, controlling by student, program, institution characteristics, the survey noise variables, country fixed effects, and field fixed effects. So let me show you now the determinants associated with the dropout rate. Remember, the sample average is 14%, so that we can put the coefficients in perspective. Okay, so all of these positive coefficients are bad because they raise the dropout rate. All of these negative coefficients are good because they lower the dropout rate. So among the things that lower the dropout rate are, for example, having a fixed curriculum. And this is very important. Most short cycle programs in LAC have a fixed curriculum, but most associate's degrees, which are the short cycle programs in the United States, don't. They have a flexible curriculum. And what that means is that the student shows up at community college, has a cafeteria style of curriculum where he sees all kinds of classes and chooses the ones that he thinks are best, but he doesn't really know how to choose. And so in the end, he takes some classes and ends up dropping out. So the fact that the curriculum is fixed in LAC is actually a good thing from the point of view of completion. Also, it seems as though industry connections are good in terms of information and equipment provision, perhaps because the student knows what to look forward to and so tries to graduate. Now, in terms of extra time to graduate, remember, on average, people take about 19% extra time to graduate. Positive coefficients are bad because they mean more time to graduate. Negative coefficients are good because it means that you graduate faster. What makes you graduate faster? When the program teaches you to work under hardship pressure, this is no surprise. When the tuition is higher, you don't want to be there longer, paying tuition. Also, when there is some kind of industry engagement, for example, when the industry participates, evaluating student skills or developing the curriculum, when there are more faculty that do have a short cycle program, and when there are more faculty connected with industry. One thing I want to mention about the things that don't contribute or that contribute negatively to the extra time to graduate is this thesis or research project. So many programs require their students to write a research project in order to graduate, but this only delays them. And that's because the program doesn't really train them to write a research project, and it might not even be necessary or relevant for them in their labor market. Determinants associated with formal employment. So remember, about 60% of the programs tell us that almost all of their graduates get a formal job. So here, all of these positive coefficients are good. They raise formal employment, negative coefficients are bad. And what are the most powerful or most helpful determinants? Teaching numerical competencies, running an employment center, offering remediation during the program, having staff assigned to collecting employment data, collecting data on whether the employers are happy with the graduates or not, hiring people that have industry experience. On the other hand, having too many young faculty apparently is not good, perhaps because they don't have enough experience. Determinants associated with wages. So positive coefficients are good, they raise wages. Negative coefficients, of course, are bad, they lower wages. What are the things that most help wages? Again, teaching numerical competencies, offering credit for longer degrees, updating the program based on labor market perception, offering remediation classes during the program, having more faculty, these smaller class sizes, and having more qualified faculty. Now, the question is, how much of that variation in program quality do these various determinants explain? So here we're going to do a Shapley-Owen decomposition of the 4 outcomes. So these are our sample sizes. These are number of programs in each of these regressions. These are our R-square, which are not particularly big. And this, I think, has to do with the fact that we are using aggregate data. And so what is the percent of R-square that we can explain with quality determinants? In general, is very high, except in the case of low wages. And I'm going to show you why. Infrastructure doesn't seem to have much of a bite. Costs matter for the academic outcomes. training and curriculum does matter, except less for law wages. Faculty also matters for academic and employment, academic outcomes and employment. The links with the productive sector also matter, but not so much for wages. And then there are other practices that have a bit of a bite. But overall, the lion's share of explanatory power really lies with training and curriculum, faculty, and link with the productive sector. Student characteristics, program characteristics, institution characteristics don't matter all that much. Field of study matters a bit more to academic outcomes. And country fixed effects matters a great deal to law wages, as we would explain. At the end of the day, labor market outcomes are very much a reflection of what's going on in the country. So it's going to be very interesting to see when we look at one country in particular, where the explanatory power comes from. So
Hey, Marta, you have 5 minutes left. Sorry to interrupt.
thank you. So that was answering that question using aggregate data. Let me tell you now what happens when we use individual level data to look at the outcomes. And so here we're going to have individual level data on outcomes, background characteristics, and previous labor market experience of the students. And this requires merging higher education data that tells me which program you attended with social security data that tells me something about your labor market outcomes. And so for Brazil, we merged the Census of Higher Education with RISE. And for Ecuador, we merged the Census of Higher Education, social security data, and tax data. And so in the end, we have for every country, all the recent short cycle program graduates, and for every country, we have outcomes, background characteristics, previous labor market performance, and the peers, background characteristics, and previous labor market performance. And in addition, for the program attended by each of these SCP graduates, we have all the survey information on the institution and the program. Once again, we apply LASSO, which means regressing individual outcomes on program quality determinants. And so LASSO is going to choose the best set of all these, always controlling for program institution characteristics, student and peers background, and previous labor market information, field fixed effects, state fixed effects in the case of Brazil. Okay, so what do we find for Ecuador? So here I am showing you two outcomes, which are percent of time employed and log of average monthly wages, and some coefficients organized by determinant. Now, percent of time employed is for the year following your graduation, what percent of the time you were employed? It's only 24% in Ecuador. That's very low. And here I am just showing you significant coefficients chosen by LASSO. And in red, I am stressing the ones that are particularly large and interesting. For example, you are more likely to be employed when the program collects student satisfaction data, when student feedback is used to update the program, when you teach numerical competencies, when you engage with industry in multiple ways. And the same thing is true for log average monthly wages. And you may want to note that all of these coefficients are actually quite large. When we do this for Brazil, we find that the percent of time employed during the year following graduation, this is larger, this is 53%. And once again, these are large coefficients that have to do, in the case of Brazil, with the possibility of taking online classes. Usually online classes are not good in the literature, but they are in the case of Brazil, and in some cases in the case of Colombia as well. And once again, things that are helpful, teaching numerical competencies, using data, updating the curriculum based on, or updating teaching practices based on student performance, providing job market information. And these coefficients, once again, are large. So now that we have individual level data, how much do we explain? So we're going to do an R and a Shapley-O in the composition. Once again, our R square are larger now that we have individual level data. And we explained about a third of the variation using the quality determinants. Once again, the lion's share of the variation comes from curriculum and training, faculty linked with the productive sector. But something else that explains a lot is these administrative variables, individual level variables at the student and the peer level. And these variables, importantly, include the previous labor market information. So to finalize, focusing on short cycle programs, this paper tried to answer the question of what makes a program good. We learned that there are certain practices that are associated with better or worse student outcomes, and we think that these results are useful to design and replicate good programs for the oversight and regulation of the programs. If I am the regulator and I know what are the practices that are associated with good programs, I come and look at you, program one, and tell you, why aren't you following this or this practice? Or look at how good the experience of this institution has been with this practice. How about if you try it? But also these results are useful for future data collection. Collecting these data was a massive nightmare, and the survey was easy relative to the nightmare of gathering the administrative data. We pursued many more countries and we never got the data for those countries. So hopefully these results will also inspire us for more and better data collection. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Maria Marta. And if there's any questions from the audience, maybe you can go ahead and ask them now. Otherwise, maybe I'll read out Joanna's question, if that's okay. So her question asks about the data. What do employers understand by formal sector? Does the definition vary by sector, country, etc.? And then there's a related question, which is, are students employed while getting the training? And if you have information on their unemployment spells.
Okay, so on the formal side, that's a good question. We are relying on the director's understanding of what the formal sector is. And then again, this is self-reported, but it matches administrative data and household survey data remarkably well. So whatever the directors understand seems to be just aligned with what household surveys and administrative data report, which is typically informal, is companies that are very small, that don't make Social Security contributions. Very often they consist of self-employed individuals. The second question was about, can you please repeat it?
The second question was about whether students are employed while they're getting the training or while they're participating in the courses. And if you have information on unemployment spells.
That's a very good question. So on the first, whether the students are employed or not, we don't know it directly. What we do know is the percent of part-time or full-time students. The percent of part-time students is about 25 or 30% on average, but it's particularly high in Brazil. In Brazil, it's about half. So it's entirely possible that SCPs in Brazil are structured in such a way, for example, the schedules are such that people can do them while they are working. The second question, the unemployment spells, we do observe their unemployment. We observe month to month, a year before they start the program and a year after they finish the program, we observe month to month their employment status. And that's why we are looking at that dependent variable when we use the individual level data, which is what percent of the time were you employed after graduation. And we use the analogous variable as a control in those regressions too.
Great, that's super interesting. I think I had a related question. First, wanted to know, I mean, this is immensely valuable for the region, right? And collecting this evidence, as far as I know, not even in the US, you get this kind of evidence. So this is all great. I guess the related question that I had is, what is the extent of regulation that's taking place within the region, or maybe one of these countries? I know that in the US, for instance, a lot of law schools tend to employ their students after they graduate in some administrative capacity in order to boost their share of graduates who are employed so that they can move up the US News and World Report ranking. That's not a response to direct regulation, but that's a direct response to incentives. So is there some regulation by any of these governments regarding like the share of students who need to be gainfully employed? Are there like a lot of these like online programs that don't deliver any gains? What's your sense of this? Just as a broad question.
Yeah, that's of course a terrific question and a very policy relevant question. The upshot is that all of these countries have some kind of licensing process. You can't just open something up. The exception perhaps was Peru until a few years ago, which is why we could only run the survey on the licensed programs. And in fact, right now, 84% of the programs are not licensed. But for the most part, at this moment today, most of the countries have some kind of licensing process in order to open the program. Throughout, however, the supervision is very sporadic. It's every 3 or 5 years, and it's mostly based on inputs and processes. It's either not at all based on outcomes, or there is very little weight assigned to outcomes. And one of the policy messages we're trying to give is, look, I mean, these programs, people go to these programs typically to find a job. That's really why they go to these programs. And so more of the regulation should be outcome-based.
Yeah, not even in a first best in which we would want some value added measure, right? But just like even in share of people who are employed afterwards, that would be great. But yeah, this all seems fascinating. I know you've done some work too with some co-authors using this data too. So in any case, I know Maria Marta, you're the chair, but I don't know if I think we're about up out of time. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, so Renato and Maria Marta, this is great sharing the session with both of you. Super interesting stuff.
Okay, so thank you very much all for coming, and look forward to seeing you in other sessions. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.